So hi, everybody. Um,
Just
my name is Shane Nielsen. I'd ask you to turn off your microphones if you would at this point.
hard for me to.
And I'm just going to help you with that right now. Okay. My name is Shane Nielsen, and I'm a member of Team Narrative at the University of Toronto.
Back to running, and I'm doing my cross training for creativity with weight training. So
Who is that? Okay. So I'm Shane Nielsen, and I'm a physician. I'm also a member of Team Narrative at the University of Toronto, and I'm also faculty, very proud faculty member of the WRC regional campus at McMaster University, working out of Waterloo. So I'd like to tell you briefly about the shape of tonight, and then I'd like to hand things over to our stellar poets who are going to take us through a special evening. And I should tell you that the title and theme of tonight is Mentoring, Illness, and Editing in Poetry, an hour of reading and conversation between Tolu, Oloruntoba, and Jim Johnstone. So it's a special thing we have. I'm really excited based on what they've cooked up. So we're going to start with Jim Johnstone tonight. He's going to share some work with us and talk briefly. Then we're going to alternate and have a little bit of a conversation in the middle involving both poets. And then Tolu is going to anchor things after that. And then after that, we're just going to move between each other. And towards the end of the night, we're going to throw things out to you. And you're going to be invited to ask questions. Now, I'm always looking in the chat. I'm a little bit of a chat monster. So if you've got a question as the night is unfolding, please do ask it. I'll watch, I'll record it, I'll collect them, and we'll address them towards the end of the night. Sound good? All right. So I'd like to introduce my good friend, Jim Johnstone now, and he's gonna take us away, and I'll be the friendly neighborhood chat watcher. So Jim Johnstone is a Toronto-based poet, editor, and critic. And he's the author of 6 books of poetry, including his incredible new book, Infinity Network, which is out from Véhicule this year, Véhicule Press in 2022. Currently, he edits the Anstruther Books imprint at Palimpsest Press, where he published The Next Wave, an anthology of 21st century Canadian poetry. Jim.
Thanks, Shane. Shane, could you click the slide so that the title of the talk comes up? So I'm going to be asking Shane to click 3 slides as I move through the presentation because he has the power here. Welcome to Mentoring, Illness, and Editing in Poetry. I'm Jim Johnstone, as Shane just said, and it's a real honor to be in conversation with Tolu Oloruntoba tonight. Next slide. So I'm going to start this talk by taking you on a personal journey through illness, poetry, and telling you how I wound up as an editor. I'll start by saying that when I was 20 years old, I was diagnosed with anxiety disorder. It was a very fraught time in my life. I was soon to start a Master's of Science in Reproductive Physiology at the University of Toronto. And I was having panic attacks. And some of these panic attacks were so severe that I wound up in hospital. I think, around this time, I was probably in hospital about 5 times. And I wanted to start this event by reading you an excerpt from an essay that I'm writing about this subject to describe one of those panic attacks. The banquet hall was quiet as all in attendance turned towards the couple on the small wooden stage exchanging vows. Earlier, I'd noticed the room was garish, congested and white tulle, but now, in the stillness, I couldn't think. Do you take this man to have and to hold? Stopped. My heart had stopped. In the rapt attention of all invited to celebrate, I pictured myself falling out of my chair and onto the makeshift dance floor before I could signal I needed CPR. For better, for worse, I took a breath. Maybe not stopped. I checked my pulse. Too fast. Yes, that was it. Dangerously fast. In sickness and in health, could I stand? I tentatively made my way to my feet, and with the entire hall pivoting to face me, walked gently to the coat rack at the back of the room. My girlfriend followed. "We have to leave now," I gasped. "We have to get help." Admitted at Markham Stouffville Hospital, I was rushed into the ER with a heart rate of 160 and a blood pressure reading that indicated I needed immediate attention. Soon, a light green curtain was drawn to cordon me off from the rest of the department, and I undressed for an electrocardiogram. I took a breath. The electrodes felt cool against my chest. Used to be in a place I could be safe, a strange calm came over me. Another breath. My symptoms slowed. I'd experienced a panic attack, according to the attending physician. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but it was the most extreme and marked the beginning of my journey to actively treat what was later diagnosed as anxiety disorder. I didn't know it then, but I'd be tied to the condition, whether I liked it or not, in a way that would determine the outcome of my life and career. So that's a little bit of prose to sort of explain how I felt during that time. And that would recur until I was diagnosed with anxiety disorder. And then I started to be treated with various drugs to try to curtail my symptoms and my experiences. It wasn't until much later in my life, when I was a full-time poet, that I was able to poeticize some of these moments. And you'll see The Chemical Life on your screen, which came out in 2017. And in that book, I wrote a number of poems that are titled with drug names and based on drugs that I took to try to treat anxiety disorder. Next slide. So this poem is alprazolam. And I'm going to read you a few of the poems from The Chemical Life now that will contrast with that first excerpt that I read to you. Alprazolam is commonly known as Xanax, and it's a central nervous system depressant. It's a fast-acting drug that's generally prescribed for people like me to take when they're in the middle of a very anxious time or panic attack. And this poem is about the first time I took the drug when I was having a panic attack in the back of a car driving through my hometown. Alprazolam. My first time prone in the back seat of a car. Skin horror-palating as if it had been kissed and funneled away in a storm, aggregate of instinct and force under pressure native to a bomb. I try my muscles, try harnessing the current blunted by the road, servant, mastered by departure, opposite the new spine expanding from the blacktop's arc. Nothing. Around each bend, the continuum persists. False horizon, second skin, the meek inheriting the sins of the well-healed. What heals once the threat ahead has revealed its weaponry? My last stand and inability to stand up, stand my ground. The roots hold less present the more time we spend together, bound by gravity alone. So what you'll see in this poem is a lot more metaphor than in the first piece that I wrote. And I really wanted to get at the disembodiment that I feel when my anxiety flares up. But not only that, the fact that a drug like alprazolam can't cure what I'm feeling, that in fact, it leaves me feeling more disembodied, maybe calmer, but it modifies my my mood in the way that a tranquilizer would. So it doesn't bring me back to a basal state. In fact, it makes me feel even more out of body and different. Next slide, Shane. So This poem is about venlafaxine. You'll see the chemical structure of the drugs on the side here. This is the chemical structure for venlafaxine. They're in the book as well. This drug is commonly known as Effexor, and it's a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. This particular poem is about a summer that I spent with a friend who was also taking the same drug, where we'd often go to the park and listen to records together. And it gets at the sensation of taking the drug a little bit too. Venlafaxine. The needle dropped out of habit, tongue interlocking with a tooth-cut groove. On Roncesvalles, before command reinforced our fear of shame, we'd circle Sororan Avenue Park like wolves loosed from the infirmary. The dame's rockets were armed with blossoms, and because we were free to fill in the field's texture, its grass and grain, I'd slide discs from poly sleeves as my brother cased the corner where moths lined the gates like lookouts beating through an unchanged city. Before the caps down to keep us more us, the gates were peacock blue. Blues rerun, each note held where an ocean threatened to overthrow the stylus mid-song, tidal flats diminishing our senses, our sense of self. Painted with a too small hand, you can see how brushstrokes overwhelm the mind, the cortex questioning, are we not? Are we not more than the first word or the last? Whoever set our interrogation to consciousness set it on the LP we mistook for landscape, set it with recurring strain, dizziness overwhelming the park's round. Curfew. Tonight, I'll move over shared ground, my mind free to feel, free will rippling out like shark gills. Next slide, Shane. So I've talked a little bit about illness and read you a few poems that have poeticized medication that I've taken to treat anxiety disorder. But illness really plays a large role in my everyday life. And everything in my life is set up around my illness in a way so that I can cope with it. So it's definitely influenced my career choice. I've held a lot of odd jobs over the course of my life, but it's become very clear that I'm not very good in a 9-to-5 work environment. My wife was just reminding me for this talk that the last 9-to-5 job I held, like within the first week, I was back in hospital. So this has really led me to take on a life of piecemeal work and a life of poetry, and it really fit that I would add editing to what I do, and it works perfectly with my schedule because I can make my own schedule. I can edit when I need to, and I can spend time dealing with my illness and putting my illness first when I need to as well. Next slide, Shane. So right now, I run Anstruther Press, which is a press that I founded in 2014. And you'll see the logo for Anstruther Press here on the left-hand side of the screen. Anstruther Press is a chapbook press. We publish chapbooks, broadsides, and manifestos, where Shane is actually the manifesto editor. And often I will take chapbooks from Anstruther Press, very special chapbooks, and turn them into trade books at Anstruther Books, which is an imprint at Palimpsest Press. And you'll see the Anstruther Books logo here on the right. Next slide, Shane. So this is where Tolu comes in. And the first time I met Tolu in print with a submission that he sent to Anstruther Press in 2018, in December 2018. And that manuscript became Manubrium, the cover of which you see here, which was designed by my wife, Erica Smith. Tolu's manuscript immediately stood out in the slush pile. His poetry was distinct, which is the first thing I look for in poetry manuscripts. It jumped off the page with a kind of restless inquiry into the natural world, and it had unusual diction, dense swaths of assonance and consonants, and absolutely knocked my socks off. The first line that I read in the manuscript, I went back and looked through my notes. The first line of the first poem was, "The bronze Bonaventure Christ has a parka of snow on his shoulder today." And from that very first metaphor, I knew that, that Tolu's work was something special. That wasn't all, though. I really felt, reading through the manuscript, like I had met a kindred spirit. Tolu is a medical doctor, and I'm trained as a scientist. But not only was there the science aspect, but Tolu wrote about mental illness, and mental illness that I could relate to. It was very fortunate that we were able to develop this manuscript into a full-length book. Next slide. And that is The Junta of Happenstance, which won the Governor General's Award in 2021. So now we're going to open things up for a little bit of conversation between Shane and Tolu and I. So we can minimize the slideshow.
Tolu, perhaps you could talk about your initial submission to Anstruther Press.
Well, I've been, thanks, Jim. Thanks, Shane. Thank you for your kind words, Jim. They mean the world to me. So I'd been sending my manuscripts around for a while before I sent it to Anstruther, and of course everyone rejected it. However, the year before that, in about 2017, I got shortlisted for a couple of chapbook contests, and I decided not to give up on writing, and so. I moved to Canada in 2018. And of course, one of the first places I went to was a public library to get books. And Jim's book was one of the first that I checked out and read. And I remember thinking it was exactly the kind of poetry that I wanted to write, because it took a scientific and very detailed look at mental illness. I was especially taken by the chemical, the chemical structures of the compounds, and so I took another crack at my manuscript, at writing some more poems, and bringing that view to it. And I'll say, Shane, that's how I began to frame my manuscript. So I framed Manubrium more or less in response to the chemical life. And so when I was sending it to Jim, I was sending it, with high hopes that, Jim would like it. And the rest is history, as they say. So Shane, I hope that answers the question.
It worked, Tolu.
Thank you. I just regurgitated your work back to you, Jim.
It's funny. As a person looking at your poems in that inbox, that wasn't the first thing that I noticed. I mean, I'm interested in the subject matter that you're exploring, but as an editor, I'm always looking for craft first. I've often said that I'm interested in how people write as opposed to what they write about. You could write about anything, but if you write about it well as a poet, then I'm interested.
And you mentioned yourself, Tolu, what you look for, I think, in inspiration in terms of your editor's praxis. But what do you specifically look for in an editor?
Well, I guess
what are you hoping for?
Exactly. That I was going to say, my answer to that question would be what I hope for, because many times writers don't have much choice in what editors they get, but you hope that the editor that picks your work for publication understands what you're saying. Can read between the lines, can touch the spirit of the work. And I knew that Jim got that. Jim, of course, as you said, craft is important and subject matter, but then there's the undercurrent of the work, and I'm very bad at describing this, but my sincere hope is that the editor gets that undercurrent and senses what I'm trying to achieve with the work. And so, yeah, that's my hope. And I've been fortunate to have, Jim and other editors, treat my work like that.
Can you speak to that, Jim? Is there something that you recognize that you tried to cultivate in that respect?
Well, I think, individual authors need individual treatment. And I'm always looking to give authors what they need in the bookmaking process, right? And that really sort of comes from discussions, from personal discussions. Editing isn't just a sort of single faceted job. I like to think of editing a manuscript as something that happens in layers, and like with a telescope, right? Like you can zoom in onto the line, but you can also zoom back and look at the structure of a manuscript, but it doesn't end there, right? The journey that I'm giving authors at Anstruther Press is a journey that takes them through an editorial process, but also branding a book, marketing a book, and I'm there for the authors at all of those stages. So there were sensitivities in Tolu's work that I'm very familiar with myself. And I think that Tolu and I bonded over that. We were able to discuss some of the poems in an interesting way. And you'll get a taste of that later in the talk when we talk about editing an individual poem in the manuscript, where you'll see some of the changes that we made. But Tolu is a special writer. He's very talented. So a lot of what I did in Tolu's manuscript was subtle. It was just what the poems kind of needed here or there, and then maybe what Tolu needed even emotionally as the book was coming out. And we were there doing that together, and that was really special to me.
We're going to talk, just as Jim mentioned, about specific poems and the editorial process with those poems in finer detail. I'm going to park that for a second. I was just wondering if you both could speak to the part of to mentorship. Jim, you briefly kind of pointed to it there in your answer. I'm wondering, Jim, if you could speak to the mentorship process at Anstruther Press, and Tolu, I'm wondering if you could speak to how you felt about the mentorship process itself. So Jim, maybe you start, and then Tolu, you can follow up.
I mean, Anstruther Press is almost like a mentorship machine. I mean, it's created to operate on several levels. So I think the most important level at Anstruther Press is often one that's missed, because the focus is on the authors and the work that's produced and published by the press. But we mentor editors, right? We have an editorial board, and a lot of these people are first-time editors, and I work with people to bring them into an editorial fold. And Tolu and I were talking, and Anstruther is interesting in that we've built a community across the country. We now have editors in a lot of the major cities in Canada. David Lee is our editor in Vancouver, and when Tolu needed to launch his book, I'm not in Vancouver, so Tolu was able to reach out to David, and David did a lot of things for Tolu and helped him out. So I mean, mentorship extends like that. And in fact, Manubrium, while it was selected by me, wasn't edited by me. It was edited by Daniel Scott Tisdale. Daniel and I did work on that book together, and both provide Tolu with feedback, but it gave it gave Tolu a different look at Anstruther Press than he got at Anstruther Books with me later on.
Tolu, how did it feel to be mentored? Did you sense it?
Well, I certainly sensed it. I'm someone that has, an anxiety disorder as well. And Jim mentioned, emotional support. Of course, I don't require my editor to be, a source of emotional support to me, but I was very grateful for it because I needed it. So, I was extremely anxious and scared, and I'll wake up in a panic sometimes and feel, I need to take that line out, or I'll worry about the finest details, and Jim was able to guide me with the wisdom that comes from experience, and so he knew what he was talking about, and so I never know what I'm doing anyways. So, it was very useful. It was very comforting to have that that wisdom guiding me.
Sometimes it's nice to just have someone tell you that the work is good, right, Tolu? Or like in your case, I do remember sometimes I just ask you to dial back, to not change too much, right? Because you're, I get all sorts of different people that I work with as an editor, but Tolu is a worker. Like he's the kind of person that wants to make it as good as it can be, and he's willing to rewrite, and he's willing to do anything to make that happen. But sometimes in authors like that, it's hard to know where to stop, right? And you can keep tweaking and tweaking and trying to make it better, and it doesn't always get better. Sometimes you get rid of the the kind of spirit that that kindled the poem by over editing it. And so there was definitely a lot of times when I had to step in and tell Tolu that, like, no, the poem's done. It's a good poem, and just sort of reassure him about that.
It's like the Kenny Rogers theory of editing. You got to know when to hold them. I was also thinking, that's a bad joke, but I was also thinking, just like in medicine, high dose reassurance most of the time, right? Most of the time. Just to conclude this wonderful little fireside chat that we're having, Jim, I'm wondering how you could. I wonder how did you approach editing the denser and the more florid pieces in Junta that you edited? Some of which, as Tolu mentioned, were written under the influence of extreme anxiety.
Right. I mean, Tolu is a dense kind of poet. That's part of what I really enjoy about his writing, and he has very, very interesting diction and word choices. There were times when I needed to pare it back a little bit, just deleting a word here and there that that might make the poems a little bit looser. I'd say that if any word would describe what I was trying to get at with Tolu's poems, it was to make them looser. And I really try to edit my own poems with that in mind, because I have a similar style. In terms of like illness itself and what the role that might have played, Tolu is unlike me. I can't write when I have anxiety or I'm sick. I just sort of lay in bed. But Tolu has actually used that as therapeutically and as a prompt to create. So I always, like, as an editor, one of the things I try to do for poets is give them a reading. I tell them what the poem is doing for me, and we compare notes and see whether it's doing what they want it to do. And so in Tolu's case, I think that I was probably able to inform around some of the poems that were written under the influence of anxiety to give him an idea of whether what was being expressed was clear or not.
Thanks, Jim. Tolu, did you want to conclude with any sort of statement there, or did you want to launch into Tolu time?
Yeah, I guess it will flow naturally. I'll just I'll continue once we we start reading the poems, because I think it's a very natural connection.
Sure. Yeah.
So as Jim said, I wrote a lot of the poems in this collection, my debut collection, under the influence of distress and mental illness. So I'd recently been diagnosed with depressive and anxiety disorders. So that was in 2017. I was trying to figure out what it all meant. I was dealing with a lot of intense emotions. I was dealing with shame for some reason. I felt I felt I wanted myself to be stronger, whatever that meant. So I was dealing with, I was trying to accept it. I was trying to, live with this new life. And when I started to use medications, the first antidepressant I was given was a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And when I read the slip, it had this litany of distressing potential side effects, including, a risk of suicide. And I felt, if I'm taking this so that I do not die? How come this medication could kill me as well? And so I initially wanted to do an erasure of the side effect slip. That didn't work. So I tried to channel the emotion or the feeling of trepidation as I was approaching the medication for the first time in this poem. So it's called She Says. My screen is weird, so I'm just going to read it from the book. She says, don't forget to breathe. I grunt through the bull run of my inner ribs, my lungs a muslin sheath of drum, stagger off the panic bus, pulled over, my night a drunk tank. Here before my pill, the fleet of plungers in my brain ready to sail. Do we need a prayer or the like for this launch? I've seen the warnings. This sertraline can reach and slash your wrists. My dark foil is only a suicide note if it succeeds. Stop when you find yourself baying at the moon. The elixir demands scrapings from a sundial's millennial face, from the skid marks of its hours. Autonomy texts show my skull sliced open after for ventilation. The brain has no nerves of its own, so I feel none of the disrobed ants, the clothes crackling with light. They wear only boots of dry ice and pneumatic drills. Their mother is the wedding of depth gauges, diviner, a wrecking ball of lie detector eyes and jawbones. I want her to reveal the secret of blood, how saplings question mark the morning above ground. She says. And so, of course, the poem ends on that, tentative note in which, we don't know what's going to happen next. And I've been grateful for, in this book particularly, I was grateful for Jim's guidance because when I write in that somewhat altered state of consciousness, my thoughts are racing. The associations in my head are sometimes bizarre, sometimes not very clear to the reader, but I tend to write through those periods as a sort of grounding technique. It takes my attention off of what I'm feeling, and then I can direct it elsewhere. But I wrote this next poem, Sparse, when Anthony Bourdain passed. I was never a big Anthony Bourdain fan. I watched his shows on occasion, but I grieved so strongly for his passing because having been intensely depressed, I could only imagine what kind of pain he had gone through. And so I felt that kinship, with him. And so in this poem, I talk about the fellowship of SADs, people who, who go through the same thing. So the neural mesh, the coral brain of SADs knows when another of us is sunk. Some speak of gray goo, the mitotic mush that will eat the world. It already has. And the sertraline suds of our sewers have not washed away the denticulate scum, the flocculent armor, the rafted pleas of the river for blood. Sentence the hanging trees to death, then. It is only right to pulp their flesh and char the inked scroll. It is only right to trace the unraveling of silicon, repelling up the beach, wicking an infinite apron line. Settle the shelf, then, let's. The reef calls our skeletons as symbiote skulls, nibble them clean. Human bones make for terrific daggers. Cast off the land, our Cretan forest, limestone spares, our stalagmite lunges, our congress can pierce the belly of a continent. And last poem I'll read from my debut is called A Finger in the Eye Should Do It. And I wrote this while, going downtown to work, downtown Vancouver. So I'll take the bus, I'll take the train. And some of those times I'll be having like an anxiety attack during, and of course I couldn't leave the SkyTrain, when it was in motion. So I needed to ground myself. And some of these images were things that occurred to me, or some things that I saw while I was on those trips to and from work. The doc explains the hole in my brain with a purgatory of plastic poppies. By the way, it was November, and people wore poppies, so, of course. A glum, a vortex of exit wounds falling out, planets of fruit wax and their storm drains, a dreamliner of swordsmen falls out, cesium blind drone boys and their elephant foot fall out, housing bubbles, unexpected contraceptive, the cower and triumph of the inadvertent falconer fall out, train cars in white cane folds fall out, mother, right in a Shel Silverstein allegory falls out, the monomania of ferry conductors, their anchors of nose rings, their barnacle hooks fall out, gray matter in peristaltic ropes, a bucket of neurotransmitters, an expanding slick of blood falls out. If the mask of the mall be grotesque, how much more weathers beneath? What if the accordion of breath be broken? What if the resonance of breech boots breaking the boombox first? I don't know, but it seems a bit much, doesn't it? Knowing if or that I've died. Will you help me look? And so, trying to dissect that poem, I decided to put up the earlier versions of this poem written on the notes app of my phone. And it was initially
let's dig into those, because we have a number of questions in the chat itself, practically begging you guys to go through the editing of poetry. So please take it away.
Sure. And so, of course, it started as fragments in my notes app. And so the fragment on the left here was, the initial thing I was thinking about, the radioactive mass, beneath Chernobyl, called the elephant's foot. And, the drone that they used to monitor the expansion of that mass of concrete and radioactive material that's just sitting there and seeping into the earth. And so, that was one of the images that came to me. And then I was thinking about the sixth sense. So I'm just going to read this, of course. So blinded by radiation, the drone operator of Chernobyl feels the elephant foot. And then there was, in the sixth sense, the good doctor dies, then gets up in the morning like nothing has happened. I don't know if I'm dead, but I know I don't feel alive. This is not life. Of course, I just decided to put my raw thoughts in there. And so, but I started to, accrete these fragments, and I started to put them down. And this is the initial rough draft called Prognosis. And Jim, let me just hand it over to you now.
Yeah, so we need the next slide, I think, Tolu. Yeah, so this is where I got the poem. It was already named A Finger in the Eye Should Do It. And you'll see my tracked changes up on the screen. The main difference between this draft and the way the poem turned out in the book is the cutting of the first stanza. So I'll read the first stanza here that was once attached to the poem. Sometimes the dead die and act like nothing has happened. They're unaware, like in the sixth sense. Sometimes, though, they just hope you don't notice. And then it goes into the poem, much unchanged from the way that it ended up being published. So what I noticed as an editor is something that's quite common, something I like to call a false start. And I love that Tolu was able to dig back into his notes and find those two excerpts that started the poem, because it really did start around the sixth sense. But then the poem that Tolu developed actually told that story without the original reference really being needed. It's very strong. The idea of that movie in an opening stanza is it's a very strong, it gives you a very strong sense. It gives you a very strong image. And I'm not sure that I wanted the reader to be biased like that. But also from a craft perspective, you'll notice the anaphora that runs through the poem, the repetition of the word fall out, or falls out at the end of a lot of the sentences that create the start of the poem. The starting here, the first stanza doesn't have that. And it really, like from a crafts sense, seems very tacked on. If you look near the end of the poem, you'll see that in this penultimate stanza, Tolu has gone a little bit long on the left, almost like he's combined two stanzas together. So we reeled that back in formally. And the last thing that we did with the poem was we actually linked it up in the book with She Says, because they seem to be kind of kindred poems that are talking very much about the same thing, and they fit in sequence in the book. So you'll see that these aren't extreme changes. They're just little changes that make the poem better. And they really started, in my mind, on a formal level, what seemed to fit the structure of the poem. Tolu, do you have anything to add to that? About what you thought about those edits?
I think they were perfect, Jim. I remember you were telling me that I don't have to take all your suggestions, but I think I took most of them, all but about 2, give or take, right? It definitely made the poem better.
Some of them spurred you to do a little bit of rewriting in places, right? Or maybe, sometimes when I edit, I'll demonstrate a change by adding a word or something that might not be a word that you would have chosen. So I know that sometimes you'd jump off of the feedback that I would give. But I mean, this case was a really good kind of, I think, clear-cut case of where, cutting a stanza could make a poem better.
Yeah, there was that poem that became Continental Want, in which you asked me what the poem meant because you weren't really getting the meaning of the poem, and I went and read the poem and I couldn't figure out what it meant. It was nonsense. It's like, what the hell is this? And so I had to rewrite it because it made absolutely no sense to me. And so, of course, I was grateful for that as well.
Shane, there's some good editing questions in the chat. The rest of the evening here for Tolu and I is we're going to read 2 poems to conclude the night. But did we want to take a few of those questions now while we're talking about editing as a craft?
Sure thing. I've got a little itinerary.
Yeah.
So let me just go up for the top and we'll move down as best we can.
Shane, you need to disable the screen share, or however you want it.
What are we spotlit as a trio right now?
We probably are.
Oh, yeah, you could keep this screen up. That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, let's keep it up because Shane's Zoom skills recommend that it stay up. So okay, let's start off with Manisha's question. How did Tolu navigate taking another crack at his own work with the inspiration of the chemical life without losing his original thread or intent? So was it better to have a poetic mentor? Like, I guess there's always kind of an anxiety or concern that the editor may dominate, and based on affinity for their work, you may head towards their work inevitably, like as a gravitational force. So the question is it better to have a poetic mentor that matches your style or interests, or do something totally different? What do you guys think?
Great question.
It is a great question. Jim, do you want me to take a first crack at that?
Yeah, absolutely.
The good thing was I had been writing for about 17 years. I started to write in about 2001. So I developed my own voice, I'd say, before I met Jim. But Jim's influence gave me permission to really delve into mental health, to really delve into the topics. It helped me refine my approach. And so, in that way, it was complementary. It didn't overshadow. And Jim never tried to, force his opinion. His opinions were always spot on. So, in terms of, is it better to have a mentor that matches? I just think it's better to have a mentor that sees the work and understands, how it can be improved. Congruence of poetic styles is not necessarily as important as that kind of attention to what the work is trying to do.
The word that I like that Tolu used, and Tolu's described the chemical life to me this way before as well, is permission. And I think that's a very interesting word, because there's a real vulnerability in Tolu's work, and that was something I was trying to get at in the chemical life as well, sharing personal stories that that others may not know. Like what's interesting about tonight's talk is that little prose excerpt that I read is a story that my wife's never heard. We've been together for years and years and years, and it's just something I've never shared. I didn't think to share it, right? So sometimes when you write things down, you can often be more vulnerable than you are in real life. In terms of having an editor that's close or not close to your poetic style or the content that you're writing, I would say that in my life, I edit all sorts of different kinds of work. I'm very, very uninterested in creating, a sort of like editorial line with like a monolithic theme or idea. I think that's actually a problem in literature today. So a lot of people are simply, as editors, taking on work that reflects their opinions or their ideas exclusively. And I try to avoid that and work with people that do a number of different things. I mean, if you look at the Anstruther Press line, you'll see concrete poets sitting beside, like neo-formalists and all sorts of things in between. So I deal with a lot of different kinds of poetry, and I try to approach everybody in the same way. And Tolu now has a lot of experience with different editors, because Dion Brand was the editor of his latest book, and he worked with Daniel to begin with at Anstruther Press. So it's not like he's staying in one lane. He's definitely, been out there getting different feedback from different people. And I think that'll be helpful in different ways, right? To make him a more well-rounded poet.
And I would veer off and follow that tangent into the Dion Brand experience and how it differed, but I'm just going to try and honor the audience and continue with the questions that they've asked. So I think I'm just going to shout out Jamie, whom I think your question was answered earlier when we talked about the editing of the poem and how things changed. So I'm going to move down to a very broad question, kind of like, what is your editorial philosophy question? From Tangina, how to edit a poem? How just basically do you approach editing, period?
That's a great question. I'd say I'd approach editing as a reader. I try to come into every poem open-minded. I read the poem several times. In the case of manuscripts, I often read a manuscript several times and sit with it and think about it before offering feedback. But there are things you notice from years of experience. Like I was talking about in Tolu's poem earlier, I often approach editing in a formal context, because what poetry does that no other art, written art can do, is the way that it merges form and content. And when you get that right, when you get that merger right, you have a real poem. So I often look at things that way, but I try to keep an open mind and give a poem what it needs. Ideally, as an editor, I say, well done. That's my favorite. It's also the hardest thing to do as an editor, to say, this doesn't need my help. Or this is far along that I can't see anything that I have to offer to a poem. Rather than just messing around to something for the sake of wanting to offer feedback. But normally there's something, there's a tweak here or there, and it just depends on where the author is at in their life or career, and even maybe the kind of feedback they're looking for. I often talk to people before editing them and ask them what they're looking for from me, particularly in a freelance context, when they're paying me to do a job. What they want and their needs, it's important for me to fulfill that.
And that, I think, addresses the final question in the list, skipping over a couple, talking about what might happen. How do I find an editor? How do I find books about editing? Jim just mentioned his freelance status, and just to plug that plug that point. You can find him on the internet everywhere. There's more questions, fellows, but and they're great questions, and they veer away a little bit from the editorial focus specifically. And I'd love to get into them, but unfortunately, time is such that we're going to get you to read some poems, which is, you know, its own benefit, of course, to the audience. And then we're going to conclude with a shout out to the narrative program at the University of Toronto in the health arts, and chat with or a final closing statement with Alan Peterkin, if possible. So please take it away.
Thanks, Shane.
Jim and Tolu.
Yeah. So I'm just going to read a poem from my second collection, Each One of Furnace. It was published in The Walrus. Well, thanks to Carmine Starina for selecting that for publication. And so it's another one of the mental health, influence of mental health poems, but this one is more focused on depression in a more stream of consciousness way. Like the mice of my childhood, blowing to soothe hills they nibbled on with white chainsaw teeth. This mood settles like 40 stories of smog. Floating before the building of carbon climbs my breath. The hand at my chest clutching for purchase crushed too. Thoughts of escape squirming in the Brownian chamber. Give me a winch poem to unspool the infinite turbine of brain fog. A turbine poem to ventilate those trees in my lung forest. The ones with elastic bands of sap garroting their cranial necks. I want a crane poem to deconstruct the sarcophagus heavy helmet and corset. The luminescent poster sun on the wall. A wrecking ball poem I can hide inside, a knuckle duster that breaks the warden's eye socket and jams the signet finger in a door, a suck poem with pennies for the kidneys of this alley. I want this depression pissing blood after hits to the side. I want renal stone poems that never let go of corridors, stabbing from within with boot knives, a heel poem to withstand jeers and be foul, fight dirty against the adulation of sadness and take a windlass to its intestines. I'm advocating violence, a hand to wrench the lead apron from the gonads of this thing, allow it to die like the rest of us, but not before we all get a glimpse of sun.
Awesome, that was terrific, Tolu. My poem that I'm going to read here to conclude can't be put on the screen because it's a little bit too long to appear on the screen. So we'll just leave it on the cover of my new book, The Infinity Network, which is where this poem comes from. The Infinity Network broadens the scope of the chemical life, in that the chemical life was a very personal book, and the Infinity Network is really a book that's meant to look at social anxiety and anxiety in society. So this poem that I'm going to read is called The Ouroboros, and it actually it's centered around a wall motif and the idea of the wall in cities and as a way of walling in or walling out. The Ouroboros. Here's the city. Here, the empty pool. The chorus of commuters making their way to the wall, walled in while infusing a wound. The wall is an emptying, a city block upturned to shake exact and endless onlookers off the paint, the pavement. The wall defines our lack of sovereignty. You and I and everybody else who isn't permanent or part of the panel paint. Beyond the gates, the only sound is the excited breathing of two dogs. The rest have run out. Run past boundaries marked with indomethacin, boundaries marked by sparrows, pigeons, the pride of urban-based evolution. Have you heard this? The wall is a whisper campaign. Homesick, housing the sick, and the testament of illness. Recovery and constraint. This island, this chest, beat, over and over, beat. The city is four walls, the mouth of a gargoyle presiding over tenants, tenements, winged brick, and beaks of see-through glass. If shouts were music, the whole world would be singing, "Don't ruin it, don't ruin it, don't ruin it." Singing, the black gasp sucks back into the gun, a deep breath oxygenating walls, approximating ribs, the body rendered in paint, breathing in, marked safe until safety is questioned. There is no question. Scab, scarab, everything safely shared between neighbors before the land is cleared. In the clearing, fireworks arch over City Hall. Archangel and enemy, Parliament elected to ensure we finish what we started. Nail sculptures, talk and talk's positive charge lassoed around the city's limits. Tagged, triggered, targeted. The black gasp sucks. The black gasp sucks back in sight of the sovereign state, a place like any other place where the way through stands in for formal-based invitation. Deformed mouth, mouth with the tail of a snake trailing its own tongue. Inexorable, incoming. The city is in motion. You've reached the wall written on the wall once you reach the ocean. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jim and Tolu. That was incredible. I really enjoyed that. It's something I haven't experienced seeing two poets discuss editing so frankly and vulnerably in this kind of context with a medical theme. Thanks so much. And you know, if we were in an audience, there'd be lots of clapping, and you'd feel warm, and the audience would be rushing up to meet you with books and that sort of thing. And Tolu's got a heart. He's got better Zoom skills than I. I want to briefly, before I hand things over to Dr. Alan Peterkin, who was our host tonight, our very gracious host, allowing us to have this space. I want to also mention our sponsors, which include the League of Canadian Poets, the Ontario Deaf, Hard of Hearing, Sick, Disabled, and Non-Neurotypical Poetics Festival, and also the Canada Council, Ontario Arts Council. So thanks to all of our sponsors and our host. And you'll see up on the screen something I'd specifically like to point to. It's not only for physicians, it's also for writers, journalists, literature scholars. So consider the narrative-based medicine program. And at this time, I would like to hand things over to Dr. Peterkin to take us home. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, I don't see myself, but I presume, am I there? Okay, here I am. Well, thank you so much, Shane, for organizing this. And again, thanks to the League of Canadian Poets for supporting our work. We've had several of these panels exploring the link between poetry and health and healing and recovery. And thank you so much to Jim and Tolu. I think it takes particular courage, even now, for doctors and scientists in particular to write about mental health issues. You know, the stigma remains. And the idea that I think what this panel has shown is that kind of psychological suffering can be transformed into something beautiful. And you've highlighted the collaboration between the editor and the author. And I'm a psychiatrist by training. I head up this program in health arts and humanities at U of T. But I work as a psychotherapist, and it strikes me that an editor clearly isn't a therapist, but the way the editor navigates the respectful boundaries of the author makes me very much think of how psychotherapy works, that there's humility. I sometimes think it's sort of like you're a passenger in the car, the author is driving or the patient is driving, and you're pointing out the odd thing, but leaving the person in control of what they're representing, what they're sharing. One of my favorite songs is from a group called The Scene Aesthetic, and it's called Beauty in the Break. There's Beauty in a Breakdown. And I encourage you to look for that song because it's just terrific. It's a celebration of, you know, losing control, experiencing extreme vulnerability, and being able to kind of grow from that, and particularly to grow artistically. And again, I just highlight the courage of writing about these things and in such honest ways. So I think that's really all I want to say, is that I just, you know, marvel at the work itself, at the courage to share that work, but also at the alchemical kind of encounter between editor and author, which is, you know, magical, but also, you know, clearly respectful and honoring the craft and paying tribute to the tradition of poetry. And Shane mentioned our program. So this is the kind of thing we love to do, is to bring people together to talk about storytelling, in this case, poetic storytelling. And we are using literature to teach our medical students, our nursing students. It's been a tough sell, and you don't want to instrumentalize literary works and sort of make them do certain things. But the idea of getting students to be in awe of a particular piece of writing and allowing that piece of writing to transform them in some kind of way. One of our great scholars at U of T is a fellow called Keith Oatley, a psychologist, and he's demonstrated with very elegant studies that reading literature actually fosters empathy in the reader. And we're not talking about medical readers or clinical readers. We're talking about any reader who can engage with that text. And engaging fully means sort of being open to it, being vulnerable to it, being made strange by it, unfamiliar to it. And so the idea of this kind of narrative competence, that we want our healers to be able to receive stories, work with stories, co-construct stories with patients over time. That's the whole movement of narrative-based medicine. And as Shane mentioned, we do have a certificate program now through the Center for Professional Development, which is just exactly exploring those creative links between literature and healing, literature and healthcare, literature, a critical lens on healthcare, the failures of healthcare, where we get it wrong. Editors can get it wrong, but clearly healthcare workers and mental health care workers can get it wrong. And again, this notion of humility about working with story is, I think, something that we share as healers and as editors. So I just want to thank you all for creating a wonderful space to talk about the creation of work, the source of work, and again, the fact that there's beauty in a breakdown. So thanks to you all.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. And thanks again, Alan, for having us.
Cheers.
Thanks, Tolu. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. Good night.
Take care, everybody.